Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight, we're sailing to an island that broke up with Africa 165 million years ago and never looked back, Madagascar, where evolution went absolutely wild and lemurs somehow ended up running the show. This is the world's fourth largest island, sitting off Africa's east coast like a massive biological experiment that nobody supervised. We're talking about a place where 90% of the wildlife exists nowhere else on Earth, where the Malagasy language connects back to Borneo despite being 6,000 miles away, and where the history is somehow even stranger than the animals. From the mystery of how people reached this isolated island, through powerful kingdoms that nearly unified it all, to the biodiversity crisis threatening its lemurs right now, this is Madagascar's complete story. If you're into history that sounds too weird to be true but absolutely is, hit subscribe. We're covering every country on Earth, one deep dive at a time. Now, settle in. Let's explore the island that time forgot. Chapter 1. Introduction and the island that time forgot. Now, before we dive into the deep end of Malagasy history, let's get our bearings on this magnificent chunk of land floating in the Indian Ocean. Madagascar is enormous. We're talking about 226,000 square miles, which makes it slightly smaller than Texas, but with significantly fewer cowboys and considerably more chameleons. To put this in perspective, you could fit England inside Madagascar about 2.5 times, though the English weather would probably improve dramatically in the process. The island stretches roughly 1,000 miles from north to south, and at its widest point it reaches about 360 miles from east to west. If you're thinking that sounds like a pleasant afternoon drive, think again. Madagascar's infrastructure would like a word with your optimism, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point is, this island is substantial, and it's positioned like a massive biological fortress off the southeastern coast of Africa, separated by the Mozambique Channel, which at its narrowest point is still about 250 miles wide. That's a lot of ocean between you and the mainland, which, as we'll discover, has shaped absolutely everything about this place. Let's rewind the geological clock, shall we? Picture this. About 170 million years ago, during the Jurassic period when dinosaurs were having their heyday, Madagascar was still snuggled up against Africa as part of the supercontinent Gondwana. Then, in what might be the most dramatic breakup in Earth's history, and we're including your aunt's divorce here, Madagascar began drifting away. First, it separated from Africa around 165 million years ago, and then, just to make things extra complicated, it split from India and Antarctica roughly 88 million years ago. India went north to eventually crash spectacularly into Asia and create the Himalayas, while Madagascar stayed put in the Indian Ocean, apparently deciding it had done enough travelling for one geological era. This ancient separation is crucial to understanding why Madagascar is so weird in the best possible way. When you isolate a landmass for millions of years, evolution goes absolutely wild. It's like leaving a teenager home alone for the weekend, except instead of a messy kitchen, you get lemurs that dance sideways across the ground and moths with foot-long tongues. The isolation created what scientists call an evolutionary showcase, a living museum of species that developed completely independently from anything on the African mainland or anywhere else. Now, let's talk about the island's geography, because Madagascar is basically a greatest hits album of different landscapes crammed onto one island. The eastern coast is where things get properly wet and wild. This region catches the Indian Ocean's moisture-laden trade winds head-on, resulting in lush rainforests that receive absolutely torrential rainfall. We're talking about 100 to 150 inches per year in some areas. These aren't your casual drizzle forests. These are the kind of forests where you can practically hear the plants growing. The coastline here is relatively straight, punctuated by lagoons and the occasional natural harbour, and it's backed by a steep escarpment that rises sharply from the narrow coastal plain. This escarpment is part of the Central Highlands, the mountainous spine that runs down the length of the island like a massive geological backbone. The Highlands are where you'll find the capital city, Antananarivo, which locals mercifully shorten to Tana, because life's too short for that many syllables, sitting at about 4,200 feet above sea level. The highest peak in Madagascar is Maromokotro, which reaches 9,436 feet and resides in the Tsaratanana Massif in the north. It's not exactly Everest, but it's respectable enough to generate its own weather patterns and make sea level visitors very aware of their cardiovascular fitness levels. The Central Highlands aren't just physically elevated, they've historically been the political and cultural heart of Madagascar, which we'll explore in excruciating but entertaining detail in later sections. The region is characterized by rolling hills, extinct volcanic formations, and a climate that's considerably cooler and drier than the steamy eastern forests. In fact, much of the highlands were once covered in forest too, but centuries of human activity transformed them into grasslands and rice paddies. The red laterite soil gives the landscape a distinctive rusty appearance, which is either beautiful or apocalyptic, depending on your aesthetic preferences and how much you enjoy the colour red. As you move westward from the highlands, the terrain gradually descends toward the Mozambique Channel through a series of plateaus and sedimentary plains. The western coast is a completely different beast from the east. It's drier, flatter, and features extensive mangrove swamps along the coastline. The rivers here are longer and more navigable than their eastern counterparts, though navigable is a relative term that definitely comes with some asterisks. The western region receives significantly less rainfall, creating savanna woodlands and deciduous forests that shed their leaves during the dry season like a giant botanical striptease. Then there's the south, which basically decided to become a desert just to prove that Madagascar could do absolutely everything. The southern tip of the island receives minimal rainfall, sometimes less than 12 inches per year, creating a landscape of spiny forests filled with bizarre plants that look like they were designed by a committee of particularly imaginative aliens. The Didieraceae family of plants, found almost exclusively in this region, include species that are basically giant thorny sticks pointing accusingly at the sky. It's unique, it's harsh, and it's spectacular in that way that makes you glad you brought water. The northern part of Madagascar adds yet another flavour to this geographical buffet. Here you'll find more tropical forests, volcanic formations including the Amber Mountain Massif, and some of the best natural harbours on the island. The northwestern region transitions into drier deciduous forests, while the northeast maintains its connection to the rainforest systems of the east coast. There's also Nosy Be, a large island off the northwestern coast that has become a tourist hotspot, probably because it has beautiful beaches and you can say Nosy Be with a straight face, which is harder than it sounds. Madagascar's climate is as varied as its topography, but it generally follows the tropical pattern you'd expect from an island sitting between roughly 12 and 25 degrees south of the equator. The east coast is hot and wet year-round. The highlands are temperate and pleasant with distinct seasons. The west is tropical but with a pronounced dry season, and the south is basically committed to being as dry as possible without actually becoming the Sahara. The island experiences cyclones during the hot rainy season from November to March, which can be absolutely devastating to coastal communities. These aren't your friendly tropical storms. These are the kind of weather systems that make you appreciate solid architecture and emergency preparedness. The rivers of Madagascar flow outward from the central highlands like spokes on a wheel, though they're generally not the mighty waterways you might expect from such a large island. The longest river is the Mangoki in the southwest, stretching about 350 miles, while the Betsiboka River is famous for its bright red colour, courtesy of all that eroded highland soil. From space, the river deltas look like Madagascar is bleeding into the ocean, which is both visually striking and environmentally concerning. The eastern rivers are short and steep, tumbling down the escarpment in picturesque waterfalls before reaching the Indian Ocean. The western rivers are longer and more gentle, meandering through the lowlands like they're not in any particular hurry to reach the Mozambique Channel. One of the most fascinating aspects of Madagascar's geography is its coral reefs. The island is surrounded by over 1,500 miles of coastline, much of it fringed with coral reef systems that are biodiversity hotspots in their own right. The southwest has particularly extensive barrier reefs, creating protected lagoons that have historically been important for both fishing and navigation. These reefs are part of the broader western Indian Ocean reef system, though Madagascar's reefs have their own unique characteristics thanks to, you guessed it, that good old evolutionary isolation. The offshore islands surrounding Madagascar add even more complexity to the picture. Besides Nosy Be, there's Île Sainte-Marie along the east coast, which has a delightfully pirate-heavy history that we'll get to later. The Mitsio Islands to the northwest, the Radama Islands, and the Barren Islands scattered along the west coast. All of these smaller islands have played roles in Madagascar's maritime history and provide additional unique ecosystems. Some of these islands have their own endemic species, because apparently regular Madagascar-level uniqueness wasn't quite unique enough. Now, here's where things get really interesting from a geological perspective. Madagascar isn't just old in the sense that it broke away from Africa millions of years ago. It contains some of the oldest rocks on Earth. The Precambrian basement rocks in some parts of the island are over 2.5 billion years old, which means they were already ancient when the first complex life forms were just figuring out how to exist. The island has significant mineral wealth, including graphite, chromite, coal, bauxite, ilmenite, and various gemstones, including sapphires and rubies. The mining sector has been economically important, though like many extractive industries, it comes with considerable environmental and social complications. The volcanic history of Madagascar is written across the landscape in lava flows and cinder cones, particularly in the north and the central highlands. While there are no currently active volcanoes, the relatively recent volcanic activity, and by recent we mean within the last few million years, because geologists have a very different sense of time than the rest of us, has enriched the soil in various regions and created dramatic landscapes. Ankaratra is an extinct volcanic massif in the central highlands that includes the second highest peak in Madagascar, and looks appropriately dramatic for something that used to explosively spew molten rock. The sheer geographical diversity of Madagascar has created an incredible array of microclimates and ecological zones, which brings us to the biological elephant in the room, or rather, the biological lemur in the rainforest. This island is one of the world's mega-diverse countries, a biological treasure trove that makes naturalists weak at the knees and conservation biologists simultaneously excited and anxious. But the wildlife didn't just appear by magic, it evolved over millions of years in isolation, creating a unique assemblage of species that Darwin would have absolutely lost his mind over if he'd made it to Madagascar instead of the Galapagos. The geographical isolation of Madagascar has essentially created what biologists call an evolutionary laboratory. Species that made it to the island, whether by floating on vegetation rafts, flying, or through pure evolutionary stubbornness, found themselves in a world with fewer competitors and predators than mainland Africa. This allowed them to diversify into ecological niches that would normally be occupied by completely different animals elsewhere. Lemurs, for instance, basically took on roles that monkeys fill in other parts of the world, except they did it with more style and significantly better developed senses of smell. Understanding Madagascar's geography and geology isn't just an academic exercise in memorizing statistics about mountains and rainfall patterns. It's fundamental to understanding why this island became such a unique, biological and cultural entity. The landscapes shaped how people lived, where they settled, what they grew, and how different communities developed in relative isolation from each other. The mountains created barriers, the rivers became highways, the coasts became gateways to the outside world, and the varied climate zones determined which agricultural practices would take root in different regions. As we'll discover in the coming sections, Madagascar's history is inseparable from its geography. The high plateaus would become the seat of powerful kingdoms. The coasts would witness the arrival of settlers from impossibly distant shores. The forests would harbour communities that developed their own distinct traditions, and the entire island would eventually become a prize that colonial powers couldn't resist trying to claim. But all of that history, the kingdoms, the conflicts, the cultural flowering, the struggles played out across this extraordinary stage we've just explored. So there you have it, Madagascar in all its geographical glory, an island that broke away from Africa so long ago that it had time to become one of the most unique places on Earth. It's got rainforests and deserts, highlands and coastal plains, rivers running red with eroded soil and coral reefs teeming with life. It's massive, diverse and complicated, which makes it the perfect subject for us to explore as we drift off to sleep tonight. Next, we'll dive into one of history's greatest mysteries. How on earth did people end up on this isolated island, and where did they come from? Spoiler alert, the answer involves one of the most impressive maritime journeys in human history, and it's way more interesting than you might expect. Chapter 2. The Most Improbable Journey. Ancient Settlement and Cultural Fusion. So here we are, standing on this magnificent island we explored in the last section, and now we need to address one of the greatest mysteries in human history, a question so bizarre that when you first learn about it, your brain does a little double take and asks if someone's pulling your leg. The question is this: why do the people of Madagascar, sitting just 250 miles off the coast of Africa, speak a language that's basically the linguistic cousin of languages spoken in Borneo, over 6,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean? It's been called the single most astonishing fact of human geography. And honestly, that's underselling it. This is the story of how Madagascar got its people, and spoiler alert, it involves some of the most impressive maritime navigation in human history. A mixing of cultures that shouldn't logically have met, and enough linguistic evidence to make scholars lose sleep for decades. Let's start with the big reveal. The first settlers to Madagascar didn't paddle across from nearby Africa. They sailed from Southeast Asia, specifically from the region around Borneo, covering a distance that would make even modern sailors nervous. We're talking about Austronesian-speaking peoples who left their homelands sometime around the 7th to 10th centuries CE, that's approximately 1300 to 1600 years ago, and somehow ended up on an island off the coast of a completely different continent. And they didn't just visit. They brought their language, their crops, their boat-building technology, their musical instruments, and their entire cultural package, which then became the foundation of what we now call Malagasy culture. Now, before we go any further, let's address the obvious question. How on earth do we know this? The answer is a beautiful combination of linguistics, archaeology, and genetics, all pointing to the same improbable conclusion. The linguistic evidence is particularly striking. The Malagasy language spoken by virtually everyone on the island belongs to the Austronesian language family, the same family that includes Hawaiian, Maori, Tagalog, and Malay. Approximately 90% of basic Malagasy vocabulary comes from the southeast Barito languages of southern Borneo, with the Maanyan language being its closest living relative. Less than 10% of the vocabulary comes from African Bantu languages, despite Madagascar's proximity to Africa. It's like discovering that people in Morocco primarily spoke Japanese. It just doesn't make geographical sense until you understand the story behind it. Linguistic researchers in the 20th century, particularly a scholar named Otto Dahl in 1951, demonstrated that Malagasy and Maanyan shared about 45% of their basic vocabulary, which is remarkably high for two languages separated by the entire width of the Indian Ocean. The Maanyan people today live along the Barito River in central Kalimantan, that's the Indonesian part of Borneo, and they're an inland agricultural people who, rather ironically, don't possess any particular seafaring skills. This raises an obvious question. If the closest linguistic relatives of the Malagasy language come from people who aren't particularly known for ocean voyaging, then who exactly sailed to Madagascar? The answer appears to be more complex than a simple Maanyan migration. The Austronesians who reached Madagascar were likely part of larger maritime trading networks dominated by Malay kingdoms like Srivijaya, which flourished between the 6th and 13th centuries CE. These trading networks connected East Asia with the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as East Africa. The Maanyan and related groups in southern Borneo were incorporated into these trading networks, possibly as labourers or secondary participants in voyages organised by more maritime-oriented Malay and Javanese traders. This explains why Malagasy has significant Malay and Javanese loanwords, particularly in vocabulary related to navigation and maritime life. Precisely the words you'd expect to borrow if your ocean-crossing adventure was facilitated by expert sailors from those cultures. The archaeological evidence for this Southeast Asian settlement remained frustratingly elusive for decades. Researchers could find human settlements in Madagascar dating to the first millennium CE, but they couldn't definitively link them to Southeast Asia. Then, in 2016, a groundbreaking study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences changed everything. Researchers analysed over 2,400 samples of botanical remains from 20 archaeological sites across Madagascar, the Comoros Islands, and the eastern African coast. They found unmistakable evidence of Asian crops, particularly Asian rice and mung beans, appearing in Madagascar between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, but notably absent from the African mainland sites. These weren't crops that could have drifted across the ocean naturally. They were deliberately brought and cultivated by people from Southeast Asia. Finally, after decades of searching, archaeologists had their smoking gun, or rather, their smoking rice grain. The genetic evidence adds another fascinating layer to this story. Modern Malagasy people are approximately 50% African in genetic ancestry and 50% Asian, representing a nearly equal contribution from both populations. Detailed analysis of maternal and paternal lineages shows that both Austronesian men and women made the journey to Madagascar, and both African men and women contributed to the gene pool. This wasn't a case of one sex from one population mixing with another sex from a different population. This was comprehensive admixture between two distinct groups. The genetic dating suggests that the major Austronesian migration occurred around 1,000 years ago, while significant Bantu migration from East Africa followed roughly 300 years later. Now, let's talk about the Bantu contribution, because while the Austronesian migration is the headline act, the African element is equally crucial to understanding Madagascar's cultural formation. The Bantu expansion, one of the largest human migrations in history, had been spreading across sub-Saharan Africa for thousands of years, bringing iron-working technology, agriculture, and Bantu languages from their origin point in what's now Cameroon and Nigeria all the way to southern Africa. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, Bantu-speaking peoples from East Africa, particularly from regions like Mozambique and the African Great Lakes area, began arriving in Madagascar. Some came as traders, particularly Swahili merchants who established trading posts along the western coast of Madagascar. Others may have come as settlers, bringing with them zebu cattle, those distinctive humped cattle that became central to Malagasy life, along with various agricultural practices and cultural traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Bantu peoples may have begun migrating to Madagascar as early as the 6th or 7th centuries, though the major waves of Bantu settlement occurred between the 10th and 13th centuries. They arrived via dhows, traditional sailing vessels used by Swahili and Arab traders crossing the Mozambique Channel from the East African coast. The Bantu contribution to Malagasy culture is substantial in areas where you'd expect African influence: livestock management, certain agricultural techniques, and cultural practices related to land and ancestors. The Bantu linguistic contribution, while much smaller than the Austronesian element, is particularly evident in agricultural and domestic vocabulary, suggesting that African arrivals brought specific knowledge that complemented rather than replaced the Southeast Asian cultural base. The question that keeps historians awake at night is, what route did these Austronesian sailors take to reach Madagascar? The distance from Borneo to Madagascar is over 6,000 miles, and there are no convenient island chains to hop across. Several theories have been proposed. One possibility is that they sailed directly across the Indian Ocean, possibly stopping at the Maldives, where evidence of old Indonesian boat design and fishing technology persists to this day, before continuing westward to Madagascar or even the Comoros. Another theory suggests they followed a coastal route, hugging the shores of South Asia and then East Africa before eventually reaching Madagascar. The fact that Austronesian crops and cultural markers appear in the Comoros but not on the African mainland itself suggests that these sailors had specific island destinations in mind, rather than being randomly blown off course. The Borobudur ship expedition of 2003 and 2004 provided experimental archaeology evidence that such journeys were indeed possible. A traditional Indonesian outrigger ship was reconstructed and successfully sailed from Jakarta to Madagascar and Ghana, demonstrating that the technology and knowledge existed to make these journeys. The ships used by these ancient mariners were likely similar outrigger canoes with sails, built using sophisticated Southeast Asian shipbuilding techniques that made them stable and seaworthy for long ocean voyages. These weren't random drifting voyages. These were deliberate expeditions by people who understood ocean currents, seasonal winds, and celestial navigation. One of the most intriguing aspects of Madagascar's settlement is the apparent timing and coordination required. The Austronesian settlement of Madagascar occurred during the same general period that Austronesian peoples were completing their eastward expansion across the Pacific, reaching Polynesia and settling virtually every habitable island between Indonesia and Easter Island. The Madagascar migration represents the westernmost extent of this remarkable expansion, an achievement that saw the Austronesian-speaking peoples become the most widely distributed linguistic family on Earth before European colonization. Imagine being part of a cultural group that colonized both Hawaii and Madagascar islands as far apart as two places on Earth can be using essentially the same maritime technology and navigational knowledge. It's mind-boggling. The fusion of Austronesian and Bantu populations on Madagascar created something entirely new. the Malagasy people and culture. This wasn't simply two cultures existing side by side. It was a genuine synthesis that created a unique identity. The Malagasy language maintained its Austronesian structure and vocabulary, while incorporating Bantu, Arabic, and later French loanwords. The material culture combined Southeast Asian elements like outrigger canoes, certain musical instruments including the valiha tube, zither, rice cultivation techniques, and architectural styles, with African elements like zebu cattle pastoralism, certain musical traditions, and spiritual practices related to ancestors and the land. One particularly fascinating cultural practice that emerged from this fusion is the famadihana, or turning of the bones ceremony, which bears striking similarities to second burial practices found among some Dayak groups in Borneo. In this ritual, families exhume the remains of their ancestors after several years, rewrap them in fresh cloth, and celebrate with music and dancing before reburying them. It's a practice that honours ancestors in a way that connects directly to the Southeast Asian origins of Malagasy culture, yet it developed its own distinct Malagasy character over centuries. The zebu cattle, meanwhile, became not just economically important but spiritually significant, with large herds representing wealth and social status, a practice clearly derived from African pastoral traditions. The early Malagasy society that emerged from these migrations wasn't monolithic. Different regions developed distinct cultural characteristics based on which influences were strongest and when different groups arrived. The coastal areas, particularly on the west coast, saw earlier and more sustained contact with Swahili and Arab traders, leading to communities with stronger Islamic influences and different cultural practices than the highlands. The eastern coast, potentially the first landing point for Austronesian settlers based on linguistic diversity analysis, maintained certain cultural elements that were diluted or changed in other regions. The Central Highlands, which we'll explore in more detail in the next section, developed its own distinct character as populations moved inland and established agricultural societies in the temperate plateau regions. Early Arab and Persian traders, who were working their way down the Swahili coast by the 10th and 11th centuries, added another layer to Madagascar's cultural mix. They established settlements on Madagascar's western and northern coasts, particularly in the region around Mahajanga, and introduced Islam to the island for the first time. These traders, including groups like the Zafiramenia traditional ancestors of ethnicities like the Antemoro, brought Arabic influences that persist in certain regions of Madagascar today. Some Malagasy words for time periods, months, and certain cultural practices have Arabic origins, and the practice of circumcision, found throughout Madagascar, may have been influenced by both Islamic and indigenous traditions. The Maikia people, a hunter-gatherer group in southwestern Madagascar who maintained their traditional lifestyle well into the modern era, have often been speculated to represent descendants of pre-Austronesian inhabitants of Madagascar, perhaps ancient African hunter-gatherers who arrived before the main settlement events. However, genetic analysis has shown that the Maikia are actually genetically similar to other Malagasy people, a mixture of Austronesian and Bantu ancestry. They appear to have adopted a hunter-gatherer lifestyle through cultural reversion, perhaps as farmers retreating into the forests during times of conflict or social change, rather than representing a remnant of earlier settlers. This finding underscores just how thoroughly the Austronesian and Bantu populations mixed to create the Malagasy people. By the end of the first millennium CE, Madagascar had been transformed from an uninhabited island, or possibly one with transient, pre-settlement visitors into a populated landscape with distinct regional cultures, all sharing a common Malagasy linguistic and cultural foundation. The incredible journey that brought Southeast Asian crops, language and technology to an island off the African coast had succeeded beyond what anyone at the time could have imagined. This fusion of Asian and African elements created one of the world's most unique cultures, a people who domesticated an entire island, bringing it into the broader Indian Ocean trading world while developing their own distinct identity. Chapter 3: Kingdoms Rise, Highland Power and Coastal Competition. Welcome back to the continuing story of Madagascar, where we left off with various groups settling across this massive island and creating their own distinct regional cultures. Now, between the 1600s and 1800s, things got properly medieval, and by medieval, we mean actual kingdoms with actual kings, complete with palace intrigue, warfare, ambitious expansion plans, and the occasional succession crisis that would make a soap opera writer jealous. This is the era when Madagascar transformed from a collection of loosely organised communities into powerful kingdoms that would shape the island's destiny for centuries. Grab your metaphorical popcorn, because Highland drama is about to collide with coastal ambition. Let's start in the Central Highlands, where the Merina people were about to pull off one of the most successful unification stories in Madagascar's history. The Merina Kingdom, also called Imerina, emerged in the Central Plateau region around the 1500s, with oral history tracing its origins to a king named Andrianampoinimerina around 1540. These Highland folk had figured out something crucial. If you can control the best agricultural land on the island and turn marshes into productive rice paddies, you've got yourself an economic powerhouse. The early Merina rulers organised massive irrigation projects, draining swamps and creating terraced rice fields that could feed a growing population and, critically, support an army. But here's where things get messy, as they always do with hereditary monarchies. King Andrianampoinimerina, who ruled around 1675 to 1710, made a decision that would haunt Imerina for nearly a century. On his deathbed, he divided his kingdom among his 4 favourite sons, creating what historians politely call persistent fragmentation and warfare. For 77 years, these 4 provinces, Avaradrano, Vakinisisauni, Vonazongo, and Maravatana, spent more time fighting each other than doing literally anything productive. The Merina were so busy squabbling amongst themselves that they became easy targets for raids by their more unified neighbours, particularly the formidable Sakalava from the west coast. Enter Andrianampoinimerina, whose name translates magnificently to the king in the heart of Imerina, and who definitely lived up to that billing. Born around 1745, he came to power in 1787 by deposing his uncle in one of those family power moves that defines pre-modern politics. Andrianampoinimerina looked at the divided, weakened state of Imerina and essentially said, "Enough of this nonsense," except in 18th century royal Malagasy, which presumably sounded more dignified. He spent the next 23 years methodically reuniting all the quarrelling provinces, establishing uniform laws and administration, and transforming Imerina from a fractured mess into a centralised state with serious expansionist ambitions. Andrianampoinimerina wasn't just a military leader. He was a genuine reformer who understood that sustainable power required more than just conquering your neighbours. He moved the capital to Antananarivo, thankfully shortened to Tana by everyone who values their time, positioning it strategically in the highlands. He revolutionised the legal system, becoming the first Merina king to establish formal civil and penal codes. He expanded the practice of fanompoana, which was essentially labour taxation, mobilising massive work teams for public projects, including further expansion of those all-important rice paddies. He even employed travelling musicians called hiragasi to spread news and promote proper social behaviour, making him perhaps the first Malagasy king to understand the power of propaganda wrapped in entertainment. The social structure Andrianampoinimerina solidified would define marina society for generations. The Andriana nobility at the top, the Hova commoners in the middle, and the Andivo slaves at the bottom. He sold slaves to French traders on the coast, using the firearms he received in return to fuel his conquests. By the time of his death in 1810, he'd successfully reunited Imerina and expanded it considerably, absorbing neighbouring territories including the Betsileo, Sihanoukka and Bezanozano peoples. His dying words to his son Radama have become legendary. "The sea is the embankment of my rice fields, basically. Madagascar's entire coastline should be the border of your kingdom. No pressure, son." Radama I, who ruled from 1810 to 1828, took his father's ambitions and ran with them at absolutely breakneck speed. He's the king who really put Madagascar on the map of European consciousness, though not always for reasons that benefited Madagascar in the long run. Radama allied himself with the British governor of Mauritius, Robert Farquhar, in a deal that perfectly illustrates the complicated politics of the early 19th century. Britain wanted to stop the French from re-establishing themselves on Madagascar's east coast, and needed to curtail the slave trade that was depopulating parts of Africa. Radama wanted guns, military advisors, and international recognition. They cut a deal. Radama would ban slave exports from territories under Marina control, and in return, Britain would supply weapons, military training, and officially recognise him as King of Madagascar. Armed with British muskets and trained by British military advisors, Radama proceeded to conquer an astonishing amount of territory. He took the eastern coast all the way to Toamasina by 1817. He launched campaigns against the powerful Sakalava kingdoms, securing submission from Manabe in 1822 after multiple failed attempts. He captured the strategic port of Mahajanga from the Boina kingdom in 1824, though he never quite managed to fully absorb the stubborn Sakalava heartlands of Menabe and Boina. By the time of his death, Radama controlled approximately 2/3 of Madagascar, somewhere between 350,000 and 400,000 square kilometres. Now let's talk about those Sakalava kingdoms, because they were the dominant power on the island before the Marina came along and ruined everyone's fun. The Sakalava, whose name probably means people of the long valleys, established themselves along Madagascar's western coast starting in the 17th century. The kingdom of Menabe was founded sometime before 1600 along the Morondava River, and the northern kingdom of Boina was established in the early 1700s. These weren't unified empires. They were more like loose confederations of territories ruled by branches of the Marosarana royal clan, held together by tribute relationships, strategic marriages, and the occasional ritual that incorporated local chiefs into the dynasty. The Sakalava were the first Malagasy people to acquire firearms in significant quantities, trading cattle and slaves to European merchants in exchange for guns. This military advantage allowed them to dominate much of western Madagascar through the 1700s, extracting tribute from other ethnic groups and raiding far and wide for slaves and cattle. The port of Mahajanga became one of the most important slave trading centres in Madagascar, and Sakalava fleets of outrigger canoes conducted seasonal slave raids as far as the Comoro Islands and the East African coast. They were, in the words of historians, dynamic and expansionist, which is academic language for extremely good at projecting military power over vast distances. The Sakalava kingdoms reached their peak under Boina King Tuakafo, who by 1720 possibly controlled the entire northern third of Madagascar. But here's the thing about loose confederations held together primarily by military dominance. They're vulnerable to succession disputes and external pressure. When Radama I came along with his British guns and his centralised marine estate, the fragmented Sakalava kingdoms couldn't mount effective unified resistance. After Radama captured Mahajanga in 1824, many Sakalava fled to surrounding islands, the Comoros, or deeper into the interior. Though Manabe and Boina maintained nominal independence, they never again posed a serious threat to marina dominance. The East Coast had its own kingdom story worth mentioning, the Betsimisaraka Confederation. Around 1712, a man named Ratsimilaho, son of an English pirate named Thomas White and a Malagasy princess, because apparently Madagascar's history needed some swashbuckling maritime romance, united the various clans of the eastern seaboard into a viable political entity. By 1730, he was one of the most powerful rulers in Madagascar, controlling over 200 miles of coastline and maintaining diplomatic relations with both the southern Betsimisaraka and the powerful Sakalava kingdoms through strategic marriages. But like many personality-driven confederations, the Betsimisaraka Union began falling apart after Ratsimilaho's death in 1754, and by the time Radama I showed up in the early 1800s, it was easily absorbed into the expanding Marina Empire. European involvement in Madagascar during this period deserves special attention because it set the stage for everything that would follow. Pirates, actual Caribbean-style pirates, frequented Madagascar in the late 1600s and early 1700s, with characters like Captain William Kidd using the island as a base for raiding Indian Ocean shipping. Some pirates settled down, married local women, and their mixed heritage descendants became part of Madagascar's coastal communities. The French established Fort Dauphin in 1642, but abandoned it in 1674 after losing too many colonists to disease and conflict. Various French and European trading posts survived, particularly at Tamatave, trading for slaves, cattle, rice, and other commodities. Under Radama I, Madagascar experienced rapid modernization or Europeanization, depending on your perspective. Radama welcomed Christian missionaries, particularly from the London Missionary Society, who established schools and helped develop a written form of the Malagasy language using the Latin alphabet. European advisors helped modernize the army along European lines. Radama even sent Malagasy students to Britain for education. It was a deliberate policy of selective westernization, taking what seemed useful from European civilization while maintaining marina political independence and cultural identity. Whether this was brilliant pragmatism or the beginning of cultural erosion is still debated by historians. After Radama's premature death in 1828, at just 36 years old, his widow Ranavalona Mine took the throne and promptly reversed course on virtually all of his Europeanization policies. Her 33-year reign from 1828 to 1861 was characterized by fierce cultural conservatism and isolation. She expelled most Christian missionaries, persecuted Malagasy converts to Christianity, and gradually forced out European traders and advisors. When Britain and France launched a joint military expedition against Madagascar in 1845, attacking Tamatave, Ranavalona's forces repulsed them. By her death in 1861, Madagascar was almost completely isolated from European influence, a remarkable achievement in an era of aggressive European imperialism. The story of Madagascar's kingdoms between 1500 and 1800 is ultimately a story of consolidation and competition. Multiple power centres marina in the highlands, Sakalava on the west coast, Betsimisaraka in the east, competed for resources, trade access, and political dominance. The marina ultimately won this competition through a combination of geographic advantages, agricultural productivity, political centralization, and strategic acquisition of European military technology. But this victory came with costs that would become apparent in the colonial period. An economy increasingly dependent on slave labour, ethnic tensions between the dominant marina and subject peoples, and deepening involvement with European powers who were gathering around Madagascar like sharks circling prey. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the complexity of building a kingdom from scratch, organising irrigation, drafting legal codes, training armies, negotiating with foreign powers, managing succession crises, and trying to unite disparate peoples under a common political system. The Marina kings and their Sakalava rivals accomplished all this without any modern technology, communication systems, or international recognition beyond what they could negotiate at gunpoint. In the next section, we'll see how this indigenous political achievement collided with the full force of European colonialism, and spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for Madagascar's independence. But for now, rest easy knowing that for nearly 3 centuries, Madagascar proved that African kingdoms could hold their own against anyone, including each other. Chapter 4: Empire's End, Colonization and the Fight for Freedom. So far, we've watched Madagascar develop from uninhabited island to thriving indigenous kingdoms, but now we need to address the elephant, or rather, the French colonial army in the room. The late 19th century was not a good time to be an independent non-European kingdom, and Madagascar, despite its impressive political organisation and fierce determination, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. This section covers the Franco-Hova Wars, 64 years of colonial rule, and Madagascar's eventual path to independence in 1960. It's a story of military defeat, cultural resistance, economic exploitation, nationalist awakening, and ultimately, freedom regained, though not without scars that persist to this day. Let's set the stage. By the 1880s, European powers were carving up Africa like an overzealous chef at a buffet. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 literally drew lines on maps, dividing an entire continent among nations that had never asked permission from anyone actually living there. Madagascar had managed to maintain its independence throughout the early 19th century through a combination of diplomatic manoeuvring, playing British and French interests against each other, and the simple fact that tropical diseases killed Europeans at alarming rates. But this balancing act was about to collapse spectacularly. The catalyst for French invasion was the Lambert Charter, that problematic document we mentioned earlier. In 1855, Prince Rakoto, the future King Radama II, signed an agreement with French businessman Joseph-François Lambert, granting him absurdly generous economic privileges, exclusive rights to all mining and forestry, exploitation of unoccupied land, basically a blank check to Madagascar's resources in exchange for a 10% kickback. When Radama II became king in 1861 and tried to honour this agreement, the Marina aristocracy had him strangled in a coup 2 years later. His widow Rasuharina became queen, but real power rested with Prime Minister Rainilaya, who promptly burned the Lambert Charter publicly in 1866 and told France where they could stick their concessions. France was not amused. They spent the next 17 years building their case for invasion, using the rejected charter as legal pretext, while their actual motivations were considerably more straightforward. Madagascar had valuable tropical resources including forests, minerals, coffee, cocoa and spices, plus strategic importance for Indian Ocean trade routes. French settlers on nearby Réunion, struggling with depressed sugar prices, saw Madagascar as potential settlement territory. The 1880s economic depression made colonial expansion politically popular in France. By 1883, France had decided that diplomacy was overrated and sent in the navy. The First Franco-Hova War began in December 1883 when French forces bombarded and occupied Toamasina on the east coast. Admiral Pierre led naval operations along the coast, while France declared a full blockade of Madagascar's ports, strangling the kingdom's economy. The marina forces, despite having some modern weapons, simply couldn't match French naval artillery and military organisation. By January 1885, French forces had captured Mahajanga in the northwest, and the Marina Kingdom was hemorrhaging resources it couldn't afford to lose. In January 1886, Queen Ranavalona III was forced to sign the Treaty of Tamatave, which ceded the northern port of Andrianampoinimerina to France, imposed a crushing 10 million franc indemnity, and gave France control over Madagascar's foreign policy. The treaty avoided explicitly declaring a protectorate, but everyone knew what it meant. Madagascar's independence was hanging by a thread. For 9 years, this ambiguous situation festered. France used its control over foreign affairs to tighten its grip, while Prime Minister Rainforests tried desperately to maintain sovereignty. Then, in September 1890, Britain, Madagascar's traditional counterweight to France, sold them out completely. In exchange for British control over Zanzibar and as part of the larger scramble for Africa, Britain recognised Madagascar as a French protectorate. The opening of the Suez Canal had reduced Madagascar's strategic importance to Britain, and they decided their relationship with France was more valuable than Madagascar's independence. It was a brutal reminder that small nations' sovereignty often depends on great powers' convenience. With British opposition neutralised, France prepared for the final conquest. The Second Franco-Hova War began in December 1894 when French Marines seized Tamatave. General Jacques Duchesne landed at Mahajanga in January 1895 with an expeditionary force tasked with marching inland to capture Antananarivo. This campaign was a nightmare. The French had to build a road through jungle as they advanced. Tropical diseases, particularly malaria, dysentery and typhoid fever, ravaged their forces, and the terrain was brutally unforgiving. Out of about 15,000 French troops in the expedition, approximately 6,000 died, with 4/5 of those deaths from disease rather than combat. For every French soldier killed in actual fighting, dozens died of fever in the lowlands. Despite this catastrophic disease toll, French superior weaponry and organisation carried the day. Prime Minister Rainforests attempted to resist at Zarasotra in June and at Andriba in August 1895, but his forces were systematically defeated. On September 30th, 1895, after a brief bombardment, French troops entered Antananarivo unopposed. Queen Ranavalona III capitulated immediately, signing a treaty that made Madagascar a French protectorate and effectively stripped the Marina monarchy of sovereign authority. Rainforests was exiled, ending his 30-year dominance of Malagasy politics. The Marina Kingdom, which had dominated Madagascar for nearly a century, had fallen. But Madagascar wasn't done resisting. In December 1895, a widespread insurrection erupted known as the Menalamba Rebellion, Menalamba meaning red togas, after the traditional cloth worn by participants. Contrary to later nationalist interpretations, this uprising was primarily directed against the Marina elite and the Christian Church, which had become instruments of an exploitative forced labour system, as much as against French rule itself. The rebels attacked Marina administrators, missionaries and church property across the highlands. The French response was to formally dissolve the monarchy entirely. On August 6, 1896, the French National Assembly voted to annex Madagascar as a colony. In January 1897, Queen Ranavalona III was deposed and exiled to Réunion. later moved to Algeria, where she died in 1917 without ever returning home. The 103-year-old Merina monarchy was abolished. General Joseph Gallieni was installed as military governor and spent the next year brutally suppressing the Menelamba rebellion. French colonial rule lasted 64 years and transformed Madagascar's economy and society in ways still visible today. Gallieni's administration centralized governance from Antananarivo, divided the island into provinces under French residence, and systematically dismantled Merina hegemony, though French administrators still relied heavily on Merina intermediaries for local governance. Infrastructure development became a priority. By the 1920s, over 20,000 kilometers of roads had been built, and the crucial Tananarive-Tamatave Railway, operational from 1908, connected the interior with the coast. These projects were funded partly by local taxes and built largely with forced Malagasy labour, under the continuing practice of fanompoana, now repurposed for colonial extraction. The colonial economy focused on export-oriented agriculture: coffee, vanilla, sisal, rice, hides integrated into global markets controlled by French interests. While this created infrastructure and increased trade volumes from 56 million francs in 1900 to over 300 million by the 1930s, the benefits flowed primarily to French settlers and companies. Slavery was abolished in 1896, but forced labour systems and economic exploitation continued under different names. French settlers occupied positions of power in government, education and business, while most Malagasy remained subsistence farmers or low-wage workers producing cash crops for export. Resistance to colonial rule never entirely disappeared. In 1913, a secret society called Vivato Sakalika Iron and Stone Network was formed by Merina intellectuals, including Protestant clergy inspired by Japanese modernization. Though brutally suppressed, this early nationalist movement planted seeds that would grow over decades. Malagasy soldiers who served France in World War I returned with new ideas about self-determination and citizenship. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, nationalist movements gained momentum, demanding labour reform, civil and political equality, and eventually independence. The Communist Party of the region of Madagascar was formed, though all political organisations were dissolved by 1939, when the colonial administration chose to support Vichy France. World War II proved to be the beginning of the end for French colonial control. Madagascar became strategically important due to its harbours, and in May 1942, British forces invaded Madagascar, which was under Vichy control in Operation Ironclad, to prevent Japanese use of the island's ports. The occupation lasted until 1943, when control was transferred to Free French forces. The spectacle of European powers fighting each other over Madagascar while claiming to represent civilization severely damaged French prestige. After the war, France was willing to accept limited self-rule, and in 1945, Malagasy representatives were elected to the Constituent Assembly in Paris. Then came the Malagasy Uprising of 1947, a pivotal and tragically bloody event. On March 29th, Malagasy nationalists revolted against French rule across much of the island. The rebellion spread across 1/3 of Madagascar and lasted over a year. French military suppression was systematic and brutal. Casualty estimates vary wildly officially. France reported around 11,000 deaths, but other sources suggest between 60,000 and 80,000. Malagasy died from violence, famine, and disease during the suppression. The rebellion was crushed, but it made clear that colonial rule could only continue through military force that France, weakened by World War II, could barely sustain. The 1950s saw France gradually accepting that decolonization was inevitable. Under the Loi cadre of 1956, reformed institutions allowed greater local autonomy. On October 14, 1958, the Malagasy Republic was proclaimed as an autonomous state within the French community, basically independence with strings attached. Philibert Tsiranana, a moderate social democrat from the Coutier regions, emerged as the dominant political figure. After a year of negotiations, Madagascar achieved full independence on June 26, 1960, with Tsiranana as its first president. The moment should have been one of pure celebration freedom after 64 years of colonial rule. But independence came with complications that would haunt Madagascar for decades. The First Republic under Tsiranana lasted 12 years and was characterized by what critics called neo-colonialism. French settlers remained in positions of power. French technical experts filled high-level government positions. French businesses dominated the economy, and Madagascar maintained extremely close ties to France. Tsiranana's government was explicitly anti-communist, aligned with Western powers, and economically dependent on French investment. While this provided stability, it also meant that political and economic power remained largely in French or French-aligned hands. Corruption and nepotism flourished under Tsiranana's paternalistic rule. The opposition was fragmented. The AKFM party, combining Protestant Marina intellectuals and communists, held only 3 seats in the legislature due to electoral systems favouring Tsiranana's PSD party. By the late 1960s, economic stagnation, declining living standards, and resentment of continued French influence create growing discontent. In April 1971, a peasant uprising in Toliara province led by the nationalist Monima movement was brutally suppressed. Then came the May 1972 revolution. Massive student-led protests against Tsiranana's pro-French policies escalated into widespread unrest across the country. On May 18, 1972, Tsiranana declared a state of emergency and handed power to General Gabriel Ramanantsoa, ending the First Republic. Madagascar had achieved political independence 12 years earlier, but now it was attempting economic and cultural independence as well. Ramanantsoa's military government cut ties with France, pursued closer relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, and attempted to reduce French influence in Madagascar's economy and education system. It was messy, unstable, and controversial, but it represented a genuine break with the colonial past. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the bitter irony of Madagascar's colonial experience. After maintaining independence through most of the 19th century while other African kingdoms fell, Madagascar succumbed to superior European military technology at precisely the moment when its political organisation was most sophisticated. Queen Ranavalona III presided over a modernising state with schools, reformed legal codes, and diplomatic relations with major powers, and none of it mattered when French artillery opened fire on Antananarivo. But also consider the resilience. Despite 64 years of colonial exploitation, Madagascar regained its independence and began the difficult work of defining what that independence would mean. In our next section, we'll explore modern Madagascar, its biodiversity, its economy, and the continuing challenges of building a prosperous nation from the complicated legacy we've just discussed. Chapter 5: Revolution, Chaos, and the Struggle for Democracy. Welcome to modern Madagascar, where we pick up the thread from 1972 when General Ramanantsoa's military government decided to cut ties with France and chart a new course. What follows is a story of socialist experiments gone wrong, economic collapse, democratic transitions that looked promising on paper but proved complicated in practice, and a pattern of political instability that Madagascar is still grappling with today. If you thought the colonial period was messy, buckle up. Post-independence Madagascar makes those years look positively orderly by comparison. After 3 years of military rule and political chaos following Ramanantsoa's takeover, Madagascar got a new leader who would dominate the island's politics for the next 2 decades, Lieutenant Commander Didier Ratsiraka. On June 15, 1975, Ratsiraka was selected by the National Military Directorate to lead the Supreme Revolutionary Council, and on December 21, 1975, he was elected president in a referendum with 95% support. This inaugurated Madagascar's Second Republic and began what would be remembered as the era of the Red Admiral. Ratsiraka's nickname, earned through his Navy background and his enthusiastic embrace of socialist ideology. Ratsiraka's guiding document was the Charter of the Malagasy Socialist Revolution, popularly known as the Boki-Mina, or Red Book, a 136-page manifesto he wrote outlining his vision for Madagascar's future. The Red Book declared that the socialist revolution is the only choice possible for us in order to achieve rapid economic and cultural development in an autonomous, humane, and harmonious manner. It advocated non-alignment in foreign policy, renovation of traditional village structures, decentralization of administration, and economic development through rigorous central planning. It promised to make Madagascar self-sufficient, free from neo-colonial dependency, and guided by socialist principles toward a glorious future. What actually happened was somewhat different. The first major actions of Ratsiraka's government set the tone for what would follow. French-held sectors of the economy were nationalized banking, agriculture, key industries in what was called economic decolonization. This was welcomed by nationalists who had long resented French economic dominance. Ratsiraka also completed the withdrawal of French military forces, closed the Diego Suarez naval base, and cut most ties with France. Madagascar pivoted toward the Soviet Union and China, signing military assistance pacts and receiving about $35 million in Soviet aid through the mid-1980s, along with Chinese infrastructure support. Ratsiraka founded his political party Arima Vanguard of the Malagasy Revolution, though unlike other African Marxist states, Madagascar maintained a nominal multi-party system where all parties had to endorse the Red Book's principles to participate. The economic results of these socialist policies were catastrophic. Madagascar's gross national income per capita peaked at $858 in 1971, dropped to $762 by 1975 when Ratsiraka took power, and continued plummeting to just $484 when he left office in 1992. Nationalization triggered massive capital flight as French and other foreign investors pulled out. State control of industry proved spectacularly inefficient. Instead of self-sufficiency, Madagascar experienced scarcity. Basic necessities were heavily rationed, infrastructure crumbled, and poverty deepened across the island. Ratsiraka's government borrowed heavily to make investments that were largely unproductive, saddling Madagascar with debt it couldn't service. To his credit, Ratsiraka recognized that his socialist experiment wasn't working and began abandoning these policies after a few years, implementing reforms recommended by the International Monetary Fund. But the damage was done, and the reforms were too little, too late. Meanwhile, Ratsiraka's political legitimacy eroded with each election. He was re-elected with 80% in 1982 and 63% in 1989, but the declining numbers told the story. The 1989 election was widely condemned as fraudulent opposition parties accused the government of refusing to update voting lists to exclude anti-Ratsiraka youth voters and stuffing ballot boxes in unmonitored rural areas. At least 75 people were killed in post-election violence. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 changed everything. Suddenly, single-party socialist rule was intellectually dead across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and African states watching their Soviet sponsors disintegrate realized the game was over. In Madagascar, opposition to Ratsiraka intensified dramatically. On August 10, 1991, approximately 400,000 people marched on the presidential palace in Antananarivo, a massive demonstration in a country of only about 12 million at the time. The Presidential Guard opened fire with gunfire and grenades. The government claimed 11 dead. Other reports placed casualties much higher. Ratsiraka claimed he hadn't ordered the violence, but his authority was shattered. Under enormous domestic and international pressure, Ratsiraka agreed to democratic reforms. A new constitution was approved by 75% of voters in August 1992, establishing the Third Republic. Multi-party elections followed in November 1992, and Ratsiraka placed second behind opposition candidate Albert Zafy. In the February 1993 runoff, Zafy crushed Ratsiraka with 67% of the vote. On March 27, 1993, after 18 years in power, the Red Admiral left office. Madagascar had transitioned to democracy, and there was cautious optimism that the country might finally stabilize and develop. That optimism proved premature. Zafy's presidency was troubled from the start. He constantly breached the constitution, clashed with the National Assembly, and failed to deliver economic improvements. In 1996, the National Assembly impeached him for constitutional violations. Elections were called, and in a stunning political comeback, Ratsiraka, who had been in exile in France, returned to Madagascar and ran again. He won the first round with 36.6%, then narrowly defeated Zafy in the runoff with 50.7%. On February 9, 1997, the Red Admiral was back in the presidential palace, now describing himself as a humanist and environmentalist rather than a socialist revolutionary. The electorate had essentially decided that however bad Ratsiraka had been, the alternatives were worse. Ratsiraka's second stint as president lasted 5 years and ended in Madagascar's most serious political crisis since independence. The presidential election of 2001 pitted the aging Ratsiraka against Mark Ravalomanana, a wealthy marina businessman who had made a fortune in the dairy industry with his company Tico and served as mayor of Antananarivo from 1999 to 2001. According to official results, Ravalomanana won 46% in the first round, and Ratsiraka won 40%, requiring a runoff. But Ravalomanana claimed he'd actually won over 50% enough to win outright and refused to participate in a runoff, declaring the official results fraudulent. What followed was an 8-month standoff that nearly tore Madagascar apart. Ravalomanana was sworn in as president by his supporters on February 22, 2002, while Ratsiraka established a rival government in his home base of Toamasina on the east coast. The country had 2 presidents, 2 governments, and competing claims to legitimacy. Ratsiraka's supporters blockaded roads to Antananarivo, dynamited bridges, and essentially besieged the capital. The population of Tana suffered tremendously. Food prices skyrocketed, thousands lost jobs, businesses collapsed, and the poor starved. The economy hemorrhaged millions of dollars in lost tourism and trade revenue. The crisis was resolved not through negotiation but through military force and economic exhaustion. After a court-monitored recount reaffirmed Ravalomanana's victory, the army sided with him and international recognition followed. Ratsiraka fled to exile in France in July 2002. In August 2003, a Malagasy court tried Ratsiraka in absentia for stealing nearly $8 million in public funds from the central bank in Toamasina before fleeing, sentencing him to 10 years hard labour. The Red Admiral's political career was finally over. He would die in France in March 2021 at age 84, remembered by supporters as a patriot who asserted Madagascar's independence, and by critics as a dictator whose policies ruined the economy. Ravalomanana's presidency from 2002 to 2009 initially seemed like a fresh start. He launched reform projects focused on rapid and durable development and declared war on corruption. His Tim party Tiako I Madagascar, meaning I love Madagascar, won commanding majorities in legislative elections. He improved infrastructure including roads, expanded education and healthcare access, and attracted foreign investment. He was re-elected in December 2006 with 55% of the vote in elections. International observers deemed generally free and fair. For a few years, Madagascar appeared to be stabilizing and developing. But Ravalomanana's second term saw mounting criticism. Opposition leaders accused him of increasing authoritarianism, mixing public and private interests, and concentrating power in his Tico business empire. The benefits of economic growth were unevenly distributed, leading to increased wealth inequality and declining purchasing power for lower and middle classes. In July 2008, Ravalomanana's government signed a controversial deal with South Korean firm Daewoo Logistics to lease half of Madagascar's arable land for cultivation of corn and palm oil, a proposal that outraged many Malagasy who saw it as selling their country to foreigners. In November 2008, he purchased a second presidential jet for $60 million, while most citizens struggled with poverty. The spark that ignited the crisis was Ravalomanana's December 2008 decision to shut down Viva TV, owned by Antananarivo Mayor Andri Rajoelina. After the station aired an interview with exiled former President Ratsiraka, Rajoelina, a 34-year-old entrepreneur and media mogul, immediately positioned himself as the voice of opposition. In January 2009, he began organizing massive protests, accusing Ravalomanana of misappropriating public funds and ruling as a dictator. The demonstrations grew increasingly violent. On February 7, 2009, Ravalomanana's presidential guard opened fire on protesters marching toward the presidential palace, killing at least 28 people and wounding over 200. The violence radicalized the opposition and weakened Ravalomanana's position. Through March, the military fractured as different units declared their loyalties. On March 8th, an elite military unit called Capsat mutinied and sided with Rajoelina. Army tanks were deployed against the presidential palace, though thousands of Ravalomanana supporters surrounded it to prevent a military takeover. On March 17, 2009, facing loss of military support and continued unrest, Ravalomanana agreed to step down and transferred power to the military, which immediately handed authority to Rajoelina. He declared himself president of a high transitional authority, ushering in Madagascar's Fourth Republic. The international community immediately condemned this as an unconstitutional coup. The African Union suspended Madagascar's membership, foreign aid was cut off, and investment stopped. Madagascar fell into one of the worst economic crises in its history. Rajoelina's transitional government, originally meant to quickly organize elections, dragged on for 4 years amid failed negotiations between Madagascar's political factions. Rajoelina exiled Ravalomanana and former President Zafi and Ratsiraka. A new constitution was approved in December 2010, but political stability remained elusive. Elections were finally held in December 2013, and Andrianampoinimerina was elected president, with Rajoelina stepping down under international pressure. Ravalomanana had returned from exile in 2014, but was immediately arrested on old charges from the Rajoelina government and sentenced to lifelong hard labour. After his sentence was lifted in May 2015, he resumed political activity. In 2018 elections, Rajoelina returned to power, defeating Ravalomanana in a runoff. He was re-elected in November 2023 in an election boycotted by opposition parties who claimed the process was rigged, taking almost 59% in voting marred by extremely low turnout. And then, in October 2025, just months before this script was written, Madagascar experienced yet another political crisis. Gen Z-led protests over chronic water and electricity outages snowballed into broader anti-government demonstrations. The same CAPSAT military unit that had helped bring Rajoelina to power in 2009 turned against him, joining protesters in demanding his resignation. Rajoelina fled the country, reportedly on a French military aircraft, marking Madagascar's latest episode of political instability. A military transitional government was formed under international condemnation, and Madagascar's political future remained uncertain. The pattern is depressingly clear. Madagascar has cycled through coups, political crises, contested elections, and authoritarian backsliding for its entire post-independence history. Democracy on paper doesn't translate to stability or prosperity when institutions are weak. Poverty is endemic, ethnic tensions persist between marina and coastal populations, and political leaders prioritize personal power over national development. The longest-serving president was Ratsiraka, and his tenure is remembered for economic collapse. The most reform-minded president was Ravalomanana, and he was ousted in a coup. Madagascar's Fourth Republic has been as unstable as its predecessors. As you drift off tonight, consider how difficult it is to build democratic governance when colonialism left behind weak institutions, ethnic divisions, and economic dependency. Madagascar gained political independence in 1960, but achieving genuine sovereignty, economic, political, and cultural, has proven far harder. In our final section tomorrow night, we'll explore Madagascar's extraordinary biodiversity, its struggling economy, the environmental challenges threatening its unique ecosystems, and whether there's hope for this remarkable island to finally achieve the stability and prosperity its people deserve. Chapter 6. Paradise Lost and Found. Biodiversity, Economy, and the Path Forward. Welcome to the final chapter of our Madagascar journey, where we explore what makes this island truly extraordinary, its wildlife, and confront the sobering reality of what threatens it. After 5 sections covering geology, settlement, kingdoms, colonization, and modern politics, we arrive at perhaps the most important question. Can Madagascar preserve its unique biodiversity while lifting its people out of crushing poverty? It's a question with no easy answers, but understanding what's at stake is the first step. So let's talk about lemurs, deforestation, economic struggles, and whether there's hope for this remarkable island. Madagascar's biodiversity is, quite simply, unlike anywhere else on Earth. Because the island broke away from Africa 165 million years ago and from India 88 million years ago, evolution proceeded in almost complete isolation. The result is endemism at levels that make biologists weep with joy and terror, simultaneously joy at the diversity, terror at how quickly it's disappearing. Approximately 90% of all plant and animal species found in Madagascar exist nowhere else on Earth. We're not talking about mere species endemism. Entire families and genera evolved exclusively on this island. Over 480 genera and 26 families are endemic to Madagascar, numbers that far surpass any other biodiversity hotspot globally. Let's start with the stars of the show, lemurs. These primates are Madagascar's flagship species, and for good reason. As of recent counts, there are approximately 113 known lemur species and subspecies, all endemic to Madagascar, except for 2 species also found in the Comoros. They range from the tiny mouse lemur, weighing less than an ounce, to the indri, which can weigh up to 20 pounds, and is famous for its haunting territorial calls that echo through rainforests. Lemurs diversified into ecological niches that would normally be occupied by monkeys, apes, and other primates elsewhere, except Madagascar never got those other primates. So lemurs had the whole island to themselves. Here's the devastating part. Over 90% of lemur species are threatened with extinction. They're the most endangered mammal group on Earth. The causes are straightforward and horrifying. Habitat destruction is the primary threat Madagascar has lost. Approximately 40% of its original forest cover between the 1950s and 2000, with the remaining forests thinned by about 80%. Slash and burn agriculture called tavy, logging for timber and charcoal production, and clearing land for cattle grazing have systematically destroyed lemur habitats. Some species are also hunted for bushmeat or captured for the illegal pet trade. When you combine habitat loss with hunting pressure, small population sizes, and slow reproductive rates, you get a recipe for extinction. But lemurs are just the beginning. Madagascar is home to over 11,000 endemic plant species. More than 80% of all its plants are found nowhere else. There are 7 species of baobab trees endemic to Madagascar. These iconic trees with massive trunks can live over 1,000 years and are central to local ecosystems and culture. The island has over 400 reptile species with 90% endemism, including the world's smallest chameleon, Bruchisia micra, which grows to less than half an inch. There are over 300 bird species with 56% endemism. The fossa, Madagascar's largest carnivore and a cat-like predator that looks like it was designed by a committee that couldn't decide between felines and viverids, is entirely endemic. Endemic frogs, geckos, snakes, insects, the list goes on and on. Madagascar is frequently called the 8th continent due to its biodiversity, and the world's highest priority biodiversity hotspot by many conservation biologists. For primates specifically, Madagascar is considered one of the 4 major biogeographic regions alongside South America, mainland Africa, and Asia, despite being only 1.3 to 2.9% the size of those continental regions. That Madagascar, with its 581,000 square kilometers, can rival Brazil's primate diversity while being only 7% its size, speaks to the extraordinary nature of Malagasy evolution. The environmental challenges are enormous. Only about 10% of Madagascar's original natural vegetation remains intact. Protected areas were a mere 3% of the land area as of 2003. Under President Ravalomanana, there was genuine political will to expand protection at the World Parks Congress. In 2003, he committed to tripling protected areas. Progress was made, but then came the 2009 coup, and conservation efforts were severely disrupted. Between 2000 and 2014, approximately 3,000 square kilometers of forest were lost even within protected areas. Illegal logging of precious rosewood for export to China, often from national parks, became rampant during political instability. Now let's address the economic elephant in the room, or rather, the economic poverty crushing Madagascar's population. Madagascar is one of the poorest countries on Earth. The poverty rate is staggering. Approximately 75 to 81% of the population lives below the international poverty line of $2.15 per day as of recent measurements. That's not a typo. Roughly 3 out of 4 Malagasy people live in extreme poverty. The multidimensional poverty rate, which measures deprivations in health, education, and living standards, stands at around 70%. Madagascar consistently ranks near the bottom of global human development indices, typically around 177th out of 191 countries. The economy, with a GDP of approximately $19 billion, relies heavily on agriculture, which accounts for over 25% of GDP and employs roughly 80% of the population. Most of this is subsistence farming, people growing rice, cassava, and sweet potatoes primarily to feed themselves and their families, not for commercial sale. Cash crop exports include vanilla. Madagascar produces about 80% of the world's vanilla, making the economy dangerously vulnerable to vanilla price fluctuations along with coffee, cloves, and spices. There's mining for graphite, chromite, nickel, and cobalt, plus a growing but still small textile industry. Tourism represents about 15% of GDP and has enormous potential given Madagascar's unique attractions, but infrastructure limitations and political instability have hindered growth. GDP per capita is heartbreakingly low, approximately $1,500 to $2,000 depending on the measurement method and year. To put this in perspective, that's roughly 1/30th of the United States GDP per capita. The unemployment rate hovers around 3 to 7% officially, but this vastly understates reality because most people work in the informal economy or subsistence agriculture rather than formal employment. Youth unemployment is particularly severe, with people aged 15 to 30 accounting for 70% of the unemployed. Infrastructure is grossly inadequate. Electricity is unreliable. The protests that helped topple Rajoelina in 2025 were initially sparked by chronic power and water outages, affecting even the capital. Roads are poor, limiting market access for farmers and increasing transport costs for businesses. Internet connectivity is limited. Educational and healthcare systems are underfunded and understaffed. Life expectancy is low due to poor sanitation, limited access to clean water, and inadequate healthcare. The country remains extraordinarily vulnerable to climate shocks, cyclones, floods, droughts, and locust infestations regularly devastate agricultural production and push more people into poverty. Here's the tragic paradox. Madagascar's biodiversity could be its greatest economic asset, but exploiting it sustainably requires infrastructure investment, institutional capacity, and political stability that poverty and political instability make impossible. Meanwhile, desperate poverty drives environmental destruction as people slash and burn forests to create farmland, cut trees for charcoal to sell, and hunt endangered species for food because they have no other options. Conservation efforts that don't address poverty are doomed to fail because hungry people will feed their children before they'll protect lemurs, and frankly, it's hard to blame them. Economic growth has been modest, typically 4 to 5% annually when political stability allows, but this barely exceeds population growth of about 2.5%, meaning per capita improvements are minimal. The 2009 political crisis caused GDP to contract by over 7%, erasing years of progress. Foreign investment dried up during the crisis and has been slow to return. International aid was suspended during the unconstitutional government period. The country still hasn't fully recovered from that disruption, and then came COVID-19. which hit Madagascar's economy particularly hard with another 7% contraction in 2020. So what's the path forward? Conservation organisations are working on multiple fronts. Community-based conservation initiatives try to provide economic alternatives to habitat destruction. Ecotourism that employs local guides, sustainable agriculture programs, payment for ecosystem services schemes. Scientific research continues to discover new species. Dozens of lemur species were described between 2000 and 2008 alone, providing crucial data for conservation planning. Protected area management is improving where resources allow, using tools like the Spatial Monitoring and Reporting tool to track threats and patrol effectiveness. Organisations like the Madagascar Fauna Group, GRP, Conservation International, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the World Wildlife Fund are active on the ground. There are genuine success stories. Some community-managed reserves have successfully balanced conservation with local development. Reforestation efforts have planted millions of trees. The SOS Lemurs initiative has funded 21 civil society organisations, many of them Malagasy-led, protecting 46 lemur species directly, with an additional 47 benefiting indirectly. Phone hotlines allow anonymous reporting of wildlife crimes. Rice intensification programs offer alternatives to slash-and-burn agriculture. These programs work, but they're drops in the ocean compared to the scale of the challenge. Madagascar's future depends on breaking the vicious cycle where poverty drives environmental destruction, which increases poverty, which drives more environmental destruction. This requires simultaneously achieving political stability so foreign investment and aid can flow consistently, improving infrastructure so economic development becomes possible, reforming governance to reduce corruption and improve public services, investing massively in education and healthcare to build human capital, developing ecotourism sustainably, ensuring conservation provides tangible benefits to local communities, and doing all of this while the climate crisis makes everything harder through more frequent extreme weather events. It's an enormous challenge, but there's reason for cautious optimism. Madagascar's civil society is increasingly organised and capable. More Malagasy scientists and conservation professionals are taking leadership roles. International awareness of Madagascar's importance is higher than ever. The potential for ecotourism is massive if Madagascar could match Costa Rica's tourism numbers relative to population. It would transform the economy. The country has untapped mineral wealth that could, if managed responsibly, fund development. There's growing recognition globally that biodiversity conservation isn't just about saving cute lemurs, it's about maintaining ecosystem services that humans need, from carbon sequestration to watershed protection to food security. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Madagascar's extraordinary journey. An island that broke away from Africa when dinosaurs roamed the earth, settled by peoples who sailed thousands of miles across open ocean, home to kingdoms that nearly unified the entire island before colonialism crushed that dream, subjected to 64 years of foreign rule, followed by 65 years of struggling to build stable governance and prosperity, blessed with biodiversity found nowhere else on Earth, yet cursed by poverty that makes protecting that biodiversity extraordinarily difficult. It's a microcosm of global challenges balancing conservation and development, overcoming colonial legacies, building inclusive governance, adapting to climate change. Madagascar's story isn't finished. Whether the next chapters tell of successful conservation and broad-based development, or of extinction and continued poverty, depends on choices being made right now by Malagasy people, their government, international organisations, and the global community. The island that time forgot, that evolutionary laboratory that gave us dancing lemurs and upside-down trees, deserves better than to become a case study in what we lost. There's still time to write a different ending. Sweet dreams, and may tomorrow bring wisdom to those who hold Madagascar's future in their hands.